The hum of the PlayStation was the soundtrack to my teenage years, a constant, comforting drone that meant escape. It was a Friday evening in the fall of my junior year, and the world outside Kyle's basement window was turning a deep, inky blue. Inside, the only light came from the massive TV screen, casting shifting blue and red shadows across our faces as we navigated a virtual war zone. "Left. He's on your left, you idiot," Kyle shouted, his controller clicking frantically. "I see him, I see him," I yelled back, my thumbs a blur of motion. A grenade icon flashed on my screen, and a second later, my soldier was pixelated gore. "Ah, crap," Kyle let out a triumphant whoop. "That's what you get for camping in a corner, Ben." This was our ritual. Every Friday, after the final school bell felt like a distant memory, I'd bike over to the Miller house. It was more of a home to me than my own, in many ways. My house was quiet, orderly, a place where feelings were discussed with the same enthusiasm as a root canal. My parents loved me, I knew that, but our conversations were a series of polite check-ins. How was school? Fine. How's the homework? Okay. But Kyle's house was different. It was lived in. There were always dishes in the sink, a dog barking at a squirrel, and the faint, comforting smell of whatever Mrs. Miller was cooking for dinner. And then there was Mr. Miller, Kyle's dad, Mark. Mark Miller was the archetype of a man I thought only existed in movies. He was a former college football player, broad-shouldered with a firm handshake that could crack walnuts. He had a deep, resonant laugh that filled a room and a way of clapping you on the shoulder that felt both encouraging and mildly dangerous. He built decks for a living, and his hands were a roadmap of calluses and scars. To my 17-year-old eyes, he was the embodiment of masculinity, strong, silent, and effortlessly in command. I admired him, and if I'm being honest, I was a little in awe of him. He was the kind of dad I sometimes wished I had. That particular Friday, after our gaming session had dwindled and we were just lounging on the massive, worn-out sectional, talking about the upcoming weekend, Mr. Miller came down the stairs. He moved with a certain heaviness, not just physical, but a weight in his steps. "Hey, boys, Ben, your mom called. She said to remind you it's your turn to take the trash cans in tomorrow." He gave me a small smile. "Thanks, Mr. Miller," I said, sitting up a little straighter, the way I always did when he was around. He nodded, but instead of heading back upstairs, he lingered. He walked over to the old bookshelf in the corner, the one crammed with board games, missing pieces, and yearbooks from a decade ago. He ran a finger along the spine of a thick, leather-bound photo album. "You know," he said, his back still to us, his voice quieter than usual. "We were looking through this the other day. Your mom and I." Kyle groaned good-naturedly. "Oh, man, not the baby pictures again. Ben doesn't need to see me with spaghetti all over my face." Mr. Miller didn't laugh. He turned around, the album in his hands. He sat down in the recliner opposite us, the leather sighing under his weight. The room felt different suddenly. The casual, after-school vibe had evaporated, replaced by something more solemn. "No, not those," he said. He opened the album. It wasn't filled with glossy photos of birthday parties and vacations. These were older, black and white pictures, and some in faded color from the 70s and 80s. They were pictures of him. We saw a young Mark Miller, all lanky limbs and a thick head of hair, standing next to an older version of the man sitting before us, his own father. In the photo, his father had a stern face, his arm around a teenage Mark, who was holding a football. They weren't smiling. "My dad," Mr. Miller began, his voice a low rumble, "was a hard man. A good provider, tough, proud. He never missed a day of work in his life. But he didn't know how to talk. Not about anything that mattered." He flipped a page. There was a picture of him in a military uniform, his expression unreadable. "He never told me he was proud of me," Mr. Miller said, and the words landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. "Not once. I got a scholarship to play ball, and he just grunted and said, 'About time you earned your keep.' I joined the reserves, and he said it would toughen me up. When I married Sarah," he said, gesturing vaguely upstairs towards the kitchen where Mrs. Miller was, "he told me she came from good stock." That was the closest he ever came to giving me a compliment. I was frozen. I could feel Kyle stiffen beside me on the couch. This was uncharted territory. Mr. Miller didn't talk like this. He talked about sports, and work, and gave us good-natured grief about our grades. He didn't talk about this. He looked up from the album, and his eyes, usually so bright and commanding, were clouded with a pain I couldn't comprehend. They weren't looking at Kyle anymore. They were fixed on me, as if I held some kind of answer. He died when Kyle was just a baby, Mr. Miller continued, his gaze unwavering. A heart attack, quick, and you know what I felt? Standing there at his funeral. Relief. The word hung in the air, ugly and shocking. Relief, he repeated, softer this time. Because the performance was over. I didn't have to keep trying to win a prize that didn't exist. I spent my whole childhood, my whole young adulthood, trying to get a single word of validation from that man. And I never got it. It left a hole in me, Ben. A hole that I've been trying to fill my whole life. He took a slow, deep breath, and I saw his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the album. And that's why, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with an emotion I now recognize as profound, desperate love, that's why I tell Kyle I love him every single day. And I tell him I'm proud of him. Even when he messes up. Especially when he messes up. Because I never, ever want him to stand at my funeral and feel nothing but relief that the old man is finally gone. He finally broke his gaze from me and looked at his son. I want him to miss me. I want him to know, deep in his bones, that his father loved him more than anything on this earth. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a living thing, pressing in on us from all sides. The hum of the PlayStation was gone. The furnace kicked on, but the sound felt distant, muffled. My mind was a frantic, scrambling mess. What was I supposed to do with this? This was a secret. This was the hidden machinery inside the great, solid clock of Mr. Miller, and he had just laid it bare for me to see. I felt like I had witnessed something sacred, something I wasn't supposed to see. I was embarrassed, profoundly uncomfortable, and yet, strangely honored. I looked at Kyle. He was staring at his dad, his expression a complex mix of confusion, pity, and what might have been understanding. This was his history, his legacy, being laid out before him in a way it never had been. I didn't know how to react. My social script for this situation was completely blank. Should I say I'm sorry? That felt insultingly inadequate. Should I nod sagely, as if I understood the weight of a lifetime of silent longing? I was 17. My biggest problems were calculus tests and whether Jessica Miller, no relation, would say yes if I asked her to the winter formal. So, I did nothing. I just sat there, my mouth slightly agape, my hands limp in my lap. I offered no words of wisdom, no comfort, no acknowledgement of the monumental trust he had just placed in me. I just absorbed the shockwave of his confession and remained utterly, completely still. After a moment that felt like an hour, Mr. Miller closed the photo album with a soft thud. The spell was broken. He gave a small, sad smile, stood up, and placed the album back on the shelf. All right, he said, his voice returning to its normal, steady timbre, though it sounded a little forced. Don't stay up too late, you two. Big day of doing nothing tomorrow. And with that, he climbed the stairs and was gone. The basement felt cavernous and empty without him. Kyle and I sat in the lingering silence for a long time. Whoa, Kyle finally said, exhaling the word like he'd been holding his breath. That was heavy. Yeah, I managed, my own voice a croak. I don't know what to say. There's nothing to say, Kyle replied, with a wisdom that surprised me. He shrugged, but it was a tense, uncomfortable motion. He gets like that sometimes. Not often, but, yeah, we tried to go back to our game, but the magic was gone. The explosions on screen felt trivial, the competition pointless. My mind was still upstairs, with Mr. Miller in the kitchen, the solid, dependable man who carried a hole inside him that was shaped like his father's approval. I made an excuse to leave early that night, saying I had forgotten about some homework. It was a lie, and Kyle knew it, but he didn't call me on it. As I biked home through the crisp night air, the world looked different. The houses I passed were no longer just structures, they were containers for countless secret stories, for quiet pains and unspoken loves. The facade of adulthood, which had always seemed so impenetrable and sure, now seemed fragile, a performance put on by people who were just as lost and wounded as the kids they were raising. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I went up to my room, the quiet, orderly room that suddenly felt sterile and empty. I thought about my own dad. He was an accountant, a man of numbers and logic. He wasn't stern like Mr. Miller's father, but he wasn't openly affectionate either. When I got an A on a test, he'd say, "Good job, son." When I struck out in Little League, he'd say, "You'll get 'em next time." They were safe, reliable responses. But sitting there on my bed, I found myself combing through my memories, searching for a time he had ever said, "I'm proud of you," or "I love you," without it being a reflexive response to my saying it first on the phone. I came up empty. It wasn't that he didn't feel it, it was that the words themselves seemed to be locked away, behind a wall of his own upbringing. The following weeks were strange. I still went over to Kyle's house, and everything was, on the surface, exactly the same. Mr. Miller was his usual self, joking with us, asking about school, his broad, calloused hands always busy with some project. But something had shifted permanently for me. I saw the love now. I saw it in the way he'd ruffle Kyle's hair as he walked by, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times but now understood as a deliberate act of rebellion against his own past. I heard it in the way he'd say, "Love you, bud," when Kyle headed up to bed. It wasn't just a habit, it was a ritual, a daily inoculation against the poison of silence. I started seeing it everywhere. I noticed the way my friend Jake's mom would pack a little note in his lunchbox every day. I saw the way my history teacher, Mr. Davis, would stay after school for hours for any student who needed help, a quiet dedication I'd previously taken for granted. Mr. Miller's confession had given me a new lens through which to see the world, and I saw the quiet, desperate, beautiful ways people tried to love each other correctly, to fix the broken things they had inherited. I even started seeing my own father differently. I noticed the way he never missed one of my sister's choir concerts, sitting stiffly in the auditorium chair but always there. I saw the way he worked long hours to pay for my braces and our summer vacations, his love expressed not in words, but in actions, in provision. It wasn't the love I now craved, the verbal, unequivocal kind that Mr. Miller practiced, but I began to understand it was his love language, flawed and silent, but real. About a month after the night in the basement, I was over at Kyle's helping Mr. Miller carry some bags of concrete from his truck to the garage. It was hard, sweaty work, and when we were done, he handed me a cold bottle of water. "Thanks for the help, Ben," he said, leaning against the truck and taking a long swig from his own bottle. "No problem, Mr. Miller." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun warm on our faces. Then, he looked at me, and there was a knowing glint in his eye. "You've been quiet lately, kid. Everything okay?" And I knew he wasn't asking about school or girls. He was asking about the weight he had handed me. He was checking in. I took a breath, searching for the right words, words that had failed me that night in the basement. "Yeah," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's all good. I've just been thinking about some stuff. Important stuff." He nodded slowly, his expression serious. He understood. He clapped a heavy, concrete-dusted hand on my shoulder. The gesture used to make me feel small, now it made me feel seen. "That's what growing up is, Ben," he said. "It's realizing that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind. Always be kind." It was the simplest, most profound advice I had ever received. The years passed. Kyle and I went to different colleges but remained close friends. I found my own path, fell in love, started a career. And through it all, the lesson from that Friday night stayed with me, a foundational truth upon which I tried to build my life. When I became a father myself, holding my newborn son in my arms for the first time, the memory of Mr. Miller's voice in that basement came back to me with the force of a tidal wave. I looked down at this tiny, perfect, vulnerable human, and I made a silent promise to him, a promise borrowed from my best friend's dad. I promised that he would never, ever have to guess how I felt about him. The words, "I love you," and "I'm proud of you," would be the currency of our relationship, spoken so often they would be as fundamental to him as the air he breathed. A few years ago, Mr. Miller, Mark, had a health scare. A minor heart attack. He was okay, but it was a stark reminder of mortality. Kyle and I, both men in our 30s with families of our own, flew home to be with the family. He was sitting in a recliner in the living room, looking thinner, older, but his eyes still had that same warm light. We talked, we laughed, we told old stories. When it was time for me to leave, I walked over to his chair. "Mark," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. It felt right. "I need to tell you something." He looked up at me, curious. "That night, a long time ago, in the basement with Kyle," I began, my throat feeling tight. "When you told me about your dad, I didn't know how to react then. I was just a kid. But I need you to know, it was one of the most important moments of my life." His eyes softened, and he gave a slow, understanding nod. You taught me what it means to be a father, I said, the words finally coming, easy and true after all these years. You taught me that strength isn't about being silent. It's about being brave enough to love out loud. You changed the entire course of my life with that one conversation. And I just wanted to thank you. For me, and for my son. I saw his eyes glisten, and he reached out and took my hand, his grip still firm despite his illness. Ah, Ben, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You were always a good kid. I knew you'd get it one day. In that moment, the last vestiges of my own awkwardness from that long ago night finally melted away. The circle was complete. The pain of one generation had been transformed into a lesson of love for the next, and then offered back as gratitude. He had given me a gift I could never fully repay, but in finally finding the words to thank him, I felt I had, in some small way, helped to fill that hole he'd carried for so long. It was a reminder that our most vulnerable moments, the confessions we make when our guard is down, can sometimes become our greatest legacies, rippling out through time and touching lives in ways we could never have imagined.